We're
Okay,
live.
good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this panel on conflicts, pandemic, and peace building, new perspectives on security sector reform in the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Gregg Carlstrom. I'm a Middle East correspondent with The Economist based in Lebanon. And so let me preemptively apologize if I should disappear at any point in the next hour because the power cuts or the internet cuts. It's happened to me a couple times in panels this year. It's nothing you said, don't take it personally. With us today, we have four distinguished panelists. So I'm going to briefly introduce them and then we can jump into the substance of the discussion here. First, we're joined by Andrea Cellino, who's the head of the North Africa desk at DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. Ranj Alaaldin is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and the director of the Proxy War Initiative with the Carnegie Corporation. Eleonora Ardemagni is an associate research fellow with ISPI, the Italian Institute for International Studies. And finally, Yezid, Sayigh, a fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center here in Lebanon. We're waiting for him to join. He should be with us hopefully in a bit. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to all of you who are tuning in as well for this discussion. Without further ado, we'll jump right in and start with Andrea, who is one of the editors of the report on which this panel is based. It's a quite lengthy report looking at security sector reform efforts across the Middle East in Libya, Yemen, Iraq. They've been tried in a number of countries with varying but limited degrees of success everywhere. And so Andrea and all of the other contributors to this report have put together, again, a more than 100-page look at security sector reform in the region, and particularly in light of COVID-19, in light of the pandemic this year and all of the challenges that resulted from it. So Andrea, as one of the editors, you have the enviable job of trying to summarize more than 100 pages of research, hopefully in about 10 minutes or so. But if you could walk us through what the main points are in the report and the main conclusions, what it is you found.
Yeah, Greg, thanks. First of all, you will allow me to thank all the authors. Also, those who are not included in this panel. Of course, we have Eleonora and Ranj, but also Irene Costantini, Jérôme Drevon, and Jalal Harshawi. And I would like to thank also the colleagues from ISPI, Annalisa Perteghella, who's the other editor, and Federico Borsari, as well as my colleague Roberta Maggi, for their cooperation to produce this report. I won't even try to summarize everything, but focusing on the aspect that is, dearest to my organization. And indeed, as you said, this report aims at shedding light on security sector reform approaches in the region, in the recent past, in the MENA region, and considering primarily the increasing role of hybrid and non-state actors, but as well as because we are in 2020, the impact of COVID-19. And each of the conflicts considered here present unique and specific challenges that would need to be addressed, and other panelists certainly can expand on this. But anyway, the findings of this study confirm that SSR programs in fragile and conflict-afflicted contexts are necessary to reinforce genuine peacemaking efforts. SSR approaches, as we at DCAF intended, don't mean only making security services more effective. In other words, they're not only about capacity building, but more importantly, about making security services more accountable, transparent, and focused on human security. And to be successful, these processes are long-term processes that need to involve institutions as well as entire societies. As the report highlights, the current situation in the MENA region is one of the rather systematically weakened or fragile state institutions. And the success of non-state and hybrid security groups has filled, in many cases, a short-term security vacuum and represents a direct response to these state failures. The cases of Libya, Iraq, and Yemen, which we are dealing with in this publication, confirm the limits of traditional disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration and SSR approaches in the region. But more specifically, the conclusions of this analysis, these various analyses, point to the need to reconsider SSR efforts in terms of first including hybrid actors into effective SSR programs, which may involve complementing what we call macro level institutional security sector reform programs with local level community engagement that acknowledges the hybrid nature of security governance. Also making hybrid actors accountable, which is easier said than done, as these groups cannot always be demobilized or integrated into security services. So their involvement in governance should not be limited to security only, as additional possibilities for transformation may exist. Also involving a broader range of security sector stakeholders, such as local administrations, the justice sector, civil society, media, and other influence groups. We need to consider how these hybrid actors, and some of the chapters highlight that, are economically and socially embedded in the local communities. And also, of course, we need to distinguish between different hybrid actors and classify them according to their willingness to reform and integrate into eventual governance framework. But very importantly, I should like to underline, SSR strategies need to address and implement security arrangements at the local level without abandoning the need for state-level approaches and institution building. Community-oriented approaches need to be, of course, based on localized security, but in a new unified state. And this may involve, depending on the conditions in different countries, coupling SSR with political reforms, such as the transformation of state authority, and when possible, its decentralization. So in sum, and to conclude, I think this report confirms the need to expand SSR support from simple and oftentimes unproductive capacity building towards a comprehensive towards comprehensive mechanisms which would be conducive to more accountability, more transparency, and ultimately more effectiveness. And crucial to this should be the involvement of oversight mechanisms, either by local administrations, as we mentioned, localizing security, parliaments, if and when present and effective, or existing internal oversight institutions, in particular those that, as we're talking about non-state actors, can also internally address corruption and illegal revenue generation schemes. I think I will stop there because I know that there are a lot of other elements that the other panelists would like and can highlight. So, and I'm happy to come back to any of the points that I made, Gregg. So over to you.
Round of questions with all four of the speakers at first, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So if we can move on to Ranj, and if we can talk specifically, Ranj, about this year, about this pandemic year through which we're all living. In your contribution to this report, you started by saying COVID-19 has added a sense of urgency to addressing security sector reform gaps in transitioning societies across the Middle East. I think one thing we've seen, not just in the region, but around the world, is that the pandemic in many countries has touched off a crisis of governance, a crisis of confidence in governance. And it's particularly acute, of course, in a region like this one, where there are pre-existing problems of legitimacy and state authority. So if you could talk a bit, perhaps, about the impact of the pandemic across the region on this balance between sort of state and non-state actors in terms of both their ability to provide services and provide security, and also public expectations or public perceptions of the same.
Of course, thank you. Thanks very much, Greg. I'm delighted to be back at the Med Dialogues, albeit virtually, and it was most certainly a privilege being part of this collaboration between DCAF and ISPI. I think, Andrea has done an excellent job of unpacking the issue we're studying and looking at today. It is a very multi-layered topic, a host of challenges that are interlocked, that often can produce some unforeseen circumstances, events. And to go, I guess, to the heart of your question, Greg, I guess it really comes down to the hybrid security order that Andrea touched on in his remarks, and how we look at this, and in terms of its implications for crises like the pandemic. The starting point for me is always, I guess, to look at how much the pandemic actually compares to the other host of crises that have engulfed the region over the past decade. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from how local communities, how governments in the region, how actors like civil society have engaged these other crises to give us an indication of how something like the pandemic can shape the contours of security and governance. The first point I would make is, let's identify the actual problem here. Because, as I say, or as I indicate in my report, it's not so much the pandemic itself that's a problem. That's a crisis, in fact. It is, of course, the failures in governance. It's the immense destitution, the misery, the socioeconomic inequalities, the violent repression that the people of the region have been subjected to, have been engulfed in over the past decade. And when you use that as your starting point, it starts to become somewhat clearer, I guess, as to how this pandemic might reinforce some of those dynamics, how the pandemic might actually open up some opportunities moving forward. On the topic of non-state actors specifically, there's two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, the pandemic, I would say, has further undermined the legitimacy, the credibility of the ruling elites in their ability to provide for their populations in terms of governance, basic healthcare, and so on. And so one would immediately from that assume that this reinforces the standing of those armed non-state actors, or those informal authorities rather, that operate at the local level and have taken on the responsibilities of basic services in the absence of state institutions. However, on the flip side, it's also become somewhat clearer in some conflict zones, in some societies, communities undergoing transitions, that non-state actors aren't really strongly positioned to grapple with or deal with a crisis of this magnitude. And so that presents a conundrum, I guess, not only for the local communities themselves, but also for international policymakers looking to address some of these gaping holes. Now, in countries that are engulfed in immense instability, it's not so much about the medium term or the long term, but rather the short term. And so, for anybody who's looking at Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and others, the pandemic might not necessarily be the immediate problem or challenge for a lot of communities. It's the ability to make ends meet on a daily basis, It's the ability to stave off the threats they face, whether that's from repressive governments, whether that's from militia groups, and so on. And of course, at the same time, it comes down to basic things like having access to clean water, rather than getting your hands on the next vaccine that might become available for this pandemic, or getting access to hospital beds or medical supplies, because the fact is those do not exist in a lot of countries or conflict zones, or are in very short supply rather. So I guess it really comes down to which sort of perspective you take. Now, moving forward and more, let's say, aligned with some of the themes that have been discussed and covered in the report, there are some serious questions that have to be asked and addressed over the coming, let's say, year, and certainly over the next 5 years. And that is, what role do we foresee for those actors that have stepped into the governance voids that has been left by weakened state institutions, collapsed state institutions, and that have been left by the sheer incompetence, by the sheer failures of the ruling elites. And that's problematic for a number of reasons, because security sector reform, for example, I don't think personally is something which is perfectly fitted for the current environment that I've just outlined, that Andrea and I'm sure others have outlined and will outline in this discussion, precisely because those tend to be focused more on long-term, generational changes. But that isn't to say you can't achieve incremental progress in the meantime. What I've touched on in my report, for example, is the notion of so-called islands of stability, where, rather than going for a national comprehensive approach to some of these problems, it's best to start small, best to start local. And that means, if you're in a position to save and provide for hundreds in a particular country, in a particular locale, then that actually can produce the stepping stones for success elsewhere in the country. It comes down to the structural mechanisms that are in place, the structural conditions, and of course, making sure that problems that currently exist do not worsen. In the case of militias specifically, for example, these actors tend to occupy 2 or 3 particular areas. You've got those actors that are too far evolved, too far entrenched, too powerful to be dislodged or even contained. And that's a reality you have to accept. There are also those actors that straddle this gray area where they're not so much evolved or entrenched, but they're on their way to becoming so. And that requires its own response. At the same time, you've got those actors that actually see the more evolved, more entrenched, mature militia groups that function as political parties or socio-political movements and have aspirations to achieve the same. Those are the actors, I would argue, as a starting point, that have to be suppressed through a combination of measures. That can be political, that can be mobilizing civil society, that can be expediting certain legislative measures, mechanisms to ensure these groups don't have the room that allows for their ascension. And in some cases, you do need to have a military alternative because, of course, these are gun-wielding actors who are, in some cases, battle-hardened. So you do need to have that willingness, I guess, to deploy some level of coercion against those actors that would otherwise move on to become too powerful, too entrenched to deal with over the course of sometimes months rather than years. And let me just finally, if I have time, Gregg, to touch on the role of international actors. I think, putting everything I've just said to one side, let's start talking about the international community and achieving a consensus within international actors in some of these conflict zones. Libya and Iraq are notable examples. Syria and Yemen we can also certainly discuss. Because when you've got, for example, on the part of the Europeans, the French and the Italians backing opposite sides in the Libya conflict, when you've got in the Gulf countries a crisis that has spilled over into Libya and has spilled over into Iraq over the past 10 decades, then it's not so much the local actors, the local forces structures that one needs to be looking at. It's actually the external actors that bear the grunt of the responsibility here, because those are the actors that are intensifying, fueling, exacerbating the very problems I've outlined through the provisioning of resources. There's a lot of that going around through the provisioning of arms. Again, there's a lot of that going around as well. And ultimately, you can't engage in good governance reform. You can't engage in security sector reforms unless there's a strategic, unified approach from the very actors that are entrusted to take on a large part of that role. Sometimes it might be individually, of course, government to government. Otherwise, it's via multilateral institutions and so on. I'll stop there, and I'd happily take any questions you or others might have, Gregg.
Them and we'll get to them after this first round of questions with the panelists. Eleonora, to come to you, you wrote about Yemen. You focused on security sector reform in Yemen in your contribution to the report. And you made the argument that for the past decade or so, this effort in Yemen has been focused on a sort of traditional top-down approach vis-a-vis the Yemeni military, the Yemeni armed forces, even as on the ground, the situation has shifted under everyone's feet. You have a large part of the country, of course, now that is outside the remit of the traditional or the official government, and therefore the armed forces. And even in areas where nominally the government is in control, of course, its authority is contested. And so you make an argument in favor of what you describe as a network-centric approach to security sector reform in Lebanon, or in Yemen, sorry. If you could perhaps talk this through a bit. First of all, what you mean by this network-centric approach, and then what you think the implications would be. What sort of obstacles you think would be overcome by taking this approach to security reform in Yemen?
Can you hear me now? Thank you, Gregg. So in my report chapter, which is a case study on Yemen, I tried to combine analysis and perspectives for policymaking. And the idea of a network-centric approach for Yemen comes from here. I acknowledge that achieving this is extremely complicated and first of all needs to be supported by a preliminary strong political commitment among the parties, domestic parties and also external backers. What does it mean, a network-centric approach? In my view, it means trying to refocus on local communities as part of a decentralized process of state rebuilding, including security sector reform. This means promoting localized security in terms of locally tailored tasks and training, for instance, but also shares of governorate budgets to be reinvested in local security, taking into account that Yemen has a strong geographical factor. And this means that governorates inside Yemen have differentiated security priorities. Think, for instance, to Hodeidah on the Red Sea. Security in Hodeidah is strongly related for me to protection of critical energy infrastructures, maritime security, and also demining activities. On the other side, for instance, Mahra, which is the eastern region governorate of Yemen, closest to the so close to the Sultanate of Oman, has to deal with border security problems and smuggling activities. So a network approach to SSR would build trust, fostering coordination among average security players. I think to the army, but I think also to the police, for instance. And this would also work as an early warning system at the governorate level. But this effort, for me, can be feasible only if clearly defined operative boundaries between the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense are established, and this is still lacking in Yemen, and obviously with a cooperative new balance between central institutions and the governorates. And this is exactly the main problem to be addressed. Since 2015, but also since 2011 onwards, state institutions in Yemen have gradually collapsed, fracturing into competing chiefdoms. I call them militiadoms, since our chiefdoms based on militias. These are micro powers on the territory, which are built on the power of hybrid military structures. And before engaging in SSR efforts, local stakeholders should identify and agree upon a single center of political power in order to reduce competitive violence. I remember that in 2014, before the war, the National Dialogue Conference agreed on a federal state structure for Yemen, on the paper, obviously. But this option needs, the option of federalism, needs strong central institutions to be effectively implemented. And this is not a paradox. I remember a well-written article by Osama Rouhani on Arab Reform Initiative on this. Strong central institutions in order to rebuild and build new center-periphery ties in Yemen. Currently, bottom-up decentralization, I think, for instance, to Mareb, to Hadramaut, and also self-governance in Sada, the stronghold of the Houthis and Mahra, have become the reality on the ground, also in terms of revenues. Another thing that you mentioned in your question, in the last decade, efforts of SSR and also of security assistance in Yemen focused on the armed forces, and especially on the army. But the army is the main place of political fields and rivalry. And these efforts of SSR focused also on top-down paramilitary units, which are built to ensure regime security. I think to the Republican Guard of Ali Abdullah Saleh and to the protection, presidential protection brigades now, while neglecting, for instance, the role of the police, which should be the closest actor to the community level in order to civilianize in the long term security provision as much as possible. I think that about 60% of Yemenis live in rural areas where the state presence is quite absent or erratic. So a network approach to SSR would invest also in other branches of the security sector beyond the army and beyond the top-down paramilitary units. The police, perhaps I tried to outline this suggestion in my chapter, a possible Yemeni Federal Guard, a gendarmerie-style force with regionally tailored tasks and training, which would help to rebalance center-periphery ties in order to complement and not to counterbalance the army, fostering community buy-in and localization of security. But again, this can work only with an agreed power center at the state level and establishing clear operative boundaries between the Ministry of Defense and of the Interior. In the book chapter, you find a more detailed paragraph on suggestion of a Yemeni Federal Guard. The traditional DDR approach in this context, for me, can't work, as it did not work before 2011, before the uprising and the collapse of Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime. Hybridity is a constant, for me, a permanent feature of the Yemeni security structure, which is now complicated further, as Ranj mentioned before, by the role of external backers, which are extremely present and active also in Yemen, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So hybridity, in my view, needs to be governed as much as possible and can't be erased from the setting. And this is exactly the challenge for security sector reform now and for the adaptation of traditional visions of security sector reform. For the moment, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleonora. And finally, Yezid, before we come to questions from the audience, Yezid, if you can maybe pull back out and look more broadly at the region and also look ahead to the future. You've, of course, been writing for a number of years about the challenges with security sector reform in the Middle East, and you've touched on a number of these points as well yourself about crumbling state infrastructure in Arab countries, about the role of external actors. As you look ahead to the near future, what do you see as the context for efforts at security sector reform in the region? And in particular, this notion of hybrid actors that's come up a few times already, where does that fit into this context?
Thanks, Gregg. This is all very rich, very interesting, and hugely challenging. The most immediate challenge, I'll put this very briefly, is that in many cases, the actors who provide some kind of public service in the form of security to their communities may be actors that Western agencies in particular don't wish to work with, although they may be the ones that are actually more responsive, ironically, to sort of some of the key ingredients of security sector reform approaches, where there's a very heavy emphasis on managerial skills and so on. I wrote about this about 10 years ago in the case of Palestine, noting that the new police force built more or less from scratch by Hamas in the Gaza Strip came far closer to the SSR model, as Western practitioners and experts recognize it, than the Western-backed police force in the West Bank did. Now, coming back to the present and looking forward a bit, going ahead, what I think is the key challenge in the region is where the state is going. There's a transformation in the state, especially you see this in Arab states, where the end of rentierism, due to the decline of finances, of financial capital, the difficulty that most economies in the region have had in generating wealth domestically, and instead are heavily reliant either on exporting hydrocarbons or else on various forms of hot money, inflows at best, inflows of remittances from diaspora expatriates. And what's happening is that in most of the region, these states are becoming more brittle. In some cases, it's common to think of Yemen or Iraq or Libya as cases that are really in trouble, and they are sort of fragile or fragmented states. But even in the more stable ones, Algeria or Egypt and others, there's a very strong trend towards increasingly repressive social pacts in which the incumbent elites are finally turning on the core socio-political constituency they relied on for decades for their power, and that is the public sector. So you're getting a shrinking of public sector wages and therefore of middle-class standards in these countries and pretty much across the entire region. Iraq's biggest dilemma is that the sort of sectarian quota system, coupled with rentier patronage-based behavior, has been based on putting more and more and more people on the payroll, especially on the security payroll, as a part of the political bargain between rival political actors. But this financially is unsustainable. And of course, with the drop in oil prices, the COVID pandemic, and the impacts, which are going to be very long lasting, this formula for maintaining the old style patronage and rentierism in any Arab country pretty much is no longer viable. Some countries are right up on the edge of the abyss right now. Others are getting there. Even in the Gulf monarchies, it's clear that they are looking at a net shift from being sources of outflow of capital to inflow of capital from 2030. I mean, that's not far away. So it's within this setting that security sector reform is supposed to take place. What I'm trying to, I guess what I really need to say is that, first of all, how likely are increasingly repressive or authoritarian states to actually be at all concerned with any of the normative values that lie at the heart of SSR? They'll take the technical training maybe, but they're not going to do much else. Given that their core goal now, and you saw this, we've seen this in Algeria, for instance, in Egypt, is that it's about becoming more repressive, then the risk really is that external providers of security assistance, or who try to sort of take a technocratic approach to SSR by providing managerial skills and so on, are, if anything, helping to sustain these systems in their current form rather than get them to actually reform in any meaningful way. The other angle to this is that there's, again, a normative bias here. Our idea that the state is somehow or should be insulated from social, economic, market trends and factors, and that some of the more what we see as abnormal or criminal behavior that happens in, say, a state like Iraq or Lebanon, corruption, for instance, including defense sector corruption, we see this simply as an aberration rather than understanding that in these states this has become how the system functions. So how do you undertake SSR? How do you inject advice or training or other material assets into a system that by its very nature is based on corruption or patronage and so on as its functioning logic? This is internal to the state, not external. And I'll stop finally with the sort of touching briefly on the hybridity, that the idea that there are sort of non-state actors who are, bad or are sort of outside the state is actually not true in many of these cases. They are part and parcel of the state. I mean, that is what the Iraqi state is today. It's a compromise. It's a historical compromise of different non-state actors, each of which maintains its own ministry, milks the payroll, and divvies up the public purse. And to approach that as if no, there are people who are sort of outside and predatory, and it's all outside, and it's the sort of the good state that somehow will be insulated from all this. None of this, I think, relates to reality. And even, as I said, in the more stable Arab states, the long-term trend is where they're not as fragile and not as fragmented, but they're increasingly brittle in the sense that they're based on ever narrowing social, political constituencies. And therefore, the very function of coercive power there is so intrinsically tied to the maintenance of an increasingly narrowly based regime that I think talking about SSR in that context loses all meaning. And where it has any meaning, let's be clear, hybrid governance is an act of concerted action, i.e. when two or more parties create a mutual reliance on the sort of modus vivendi or on the governing arrangement. So let's not, let's keep in mind what's going on here is actually, again, a political deal, a compromise about how to run the state and what governance means in the real world that often goes against the fundamentals of what we think of as SSR. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Yezid. We will happily take questions now from anyone in the audience who has a question they'd like to ask. But one thing briefly, while we're waiting for questions, that I would throw out, perhaps both to Ranj and to Eleonora. Yezid, you mentioned the economic dynamics in the Middle East and the sort of rentier model that is collapsing, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic, both directly by this pandemic that has curtailed a range of economic activity in the region, and then, of course, by the consequent drop in oil prices, which has implications for Iraq, for the Gulf states. So perhaps both for Ranj and Eleonora, when it comes to either Iraq, which is directly financed by oil revenue, or to Yemen, which relies quite heavily on Saudi Arabia for remittances, for direct financial support, what do you think the likely impact of the economic crisis in the region is going to be for the security sector and for, again, both sort of state and non-state actors.
Do you want to go first, Eleonora?
Oh, please, Ranj.
Okay, sure. Well, I think it's a great question, Gregg. In terms of its impact, we're already seeing the immediate implications, certainly in a country like Iraq, but also elsewhere. When you're mired in economic crisis, the stakes effectively become a lot higher. And it creates that environment of immense unease and uncertainty. And that never bodes well for any reform process, whether it's security-focused governance, economic development. And what you've seen in a country like Iraq, which I follow rather closely, is certain actors, political militia groups, those actors that lie in between, drawing their own red lines. It's an environment where things like elections, for example, are at risk of becoming tainted, undermined, destabilized, because it becomes a question of survival for these actors, rather than a question of acquiring greater legitimacy, greater constitutional or popular legitimacy. And that's tied directly to the implications that the current economic crisis has presented to these actors. Because, to put it simply, if your coffers, if your resources are at risk of being diminished, if those resources start to dwindle, then that means your ability to maintain patronage networks, your ability to maintain the influence or the control that you have over key institutions, over key communal structures that are critical to your standing, both politically, reputationally, and of course, resources that from a very pragmatic angle allow you to acquire the weapons and the supplies that your rivals can't. So when you've got this, let's say, this delicate equilibrium of power disrupted by something like the decline in oil prices, by the limited resources on offer from state institutions, with the stakes much higher, what you're seeing is a let's say more intense embrace of using violence to maintain your control. In a country like Iraq, that's led to brutal attacks on innocent protesters. It's led to a point where some groups no longer really, to put it frankly, care much about whether the forthcoming elections are going to be legitimate or not. For them, it's maintaining that stranglehold over the key institutions of power, maintaining whatever control they have, and of course, waiting out the crisis that you have right now for as long as is possible. But there's a lot more to say about that, but I'll give Eleonora to bring a chance to bring in the Yemen case study.
Sure. The implications of the global financial constraints triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic are likely to worsen the financial outlook for Yemen, impacting on international assistance and funding for SSR. This context, I think, represents the perfect environment for the further rise of militias. And thanks also to the external backing, I think especially to southern militias in Yemen. And on the other hand, Saudi Arabia, for instance, which has been is affected by the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic from financial side, is much more involved now in attempts of security sector reform in Yemen than before. I think, for instance, to the Riyadh Agreement signed in 2019 to create a unified government between the internationally recognized government of Yemen and the ISPI, the Southern Transitional Council. Since the Riyadh Agreement states that Saudi Arabia exercises now a direct supervision over military decisions, especially in Aden, and this is also reported by the UN Panel of Experts report 2020. And on the other hand, Saudi Arabia is directly responsible now for the support of the forces which are trying to secure the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, which is another big issue of the conflict. I quote again the UN Panel of Experts report 2020. The Yemeni fighters operating on the Yemen's border side are rallied in military units affiliated to Saudi Arabia. And this means that the Saudis have now a stronger role. Also, if we look at the ongoing attempts of SSR in Yemen, SSR is a process that we imagine, especially for the post-conflict, and so we ask about the impact of financial constraints on this. But this is also an ongoing project that in pieces has been already emerging in the country since Yemen is increasingly fragmented at its interior. So I think this factor, financial constraints, we will see in the long term, but it probably enhance the level of competition among external backers in Yemen, and also their ability to gain leverage in the internal setting.
Okay, thank you both. Yezid, the question that was submitted for you. Given several hybrid actors, multiple revenue generation mechanisms, so aside from state salaries, they often operate outside of the control of central authorities in which they are entrenched. How can SSR reckon with this reality and contribute to building security sector integrity?
Well, that's a very pertinent question. I think that, well, first of all, let's be clear that many of the more problematic market behaviors or economic behaviors of non-state actors or sub or semi-state actors, because we have a whole range, occur within the state sector as well and within the official military and security services as well. So if we're looking at criminal or predatory behavior, it's rarely something that happens exclusively, by these non-state actors. And what's most troubling and worrying is how much this is actually a part of the system in many countries, the ones that most need reform, and therefore implementing reform in a place where the payroll, for instance, is a major source of corruption or of mismanagement, or where commission taking on procurement, and not just of weapons, but of everything, uniforms, facilities, construction, food, etc. In that kind of setting, you have to be really careful of what you're rolling out in the way of reform program or an assistance program, because the risk, as I said earlier, is that you're actually simply feeding the sort of the capture of these resources by actors. And those resources aren't always material. They could be political in the sense that one actor that's favored by an external donor is then in a stronger position vis-a-vis other actors within their own ministry or their own armed forces. So there's no good answer to this. I think sadly, the sort of rather melancholy answer is that security sector reform is entirely political. It won't happen without serious political will at the top, and also a lot of demand at the bottom. Often the problem lies in the middle, in between, and getting to that middle is very challenging, because you also need sort of parallel complementing safeguards So for instance, a country like Egypt, I produced a report exactly a year ago on the Egyptian military economy. Egypt is a country with an immense number of laws, regulations, internal statutes governing almost everything to do with procurement. But there's just so many different procurement regulations with so many exemptions and such a labyrinth that in fact the system allows for an immense amount of misuse, abuse, or just plain waste. And so, you know, in other words, you have to have a procurement system that is simplified and transparent alongside a budgeting system and a financial management system so that you know who's getting put on the payroll. You have to work against a lot of resistance in quite a few countries in the region against having methods of actually delivering payment directly to personnel rather than through officers who may pocket some of the money or put ghost soldiers on the payroll. And of course, countries like Iraq, where you will get a lot of the system works where senior officers will take a cut out of the junior officers' salaries and so on down the line. So approaching this purely within one ministry or purely within one service isn't going to work unless you're also working on parallel tracks that provide the transparency and accountability and so on, and enforceability, which means the justice sector, which in many of these cases, again, is highly partisan politically or also increasingly corrupt. So it's sadly, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation with a pretty large chicken and a massive egg, how to get them in order. Unfortunately, I think that for outside powers coming in and trying to engineer all this in the face of a system that thrives on these problems and these flaws is almost impossible, bluntly, because I think no external power is sufficiently invested or able to bring sufficient leverage to bear to change such fundamental incentive structures.
And Andrea, I think you had something that you wanted to add specifically about Libya in this case.
Yes, thanks. I mean, in the meantime, of course, Yezid made a number of remarks about the value and the characteristics of a good SSR approach, which I totally subscribe to. I wanted to go back to the question of the economic element and then perhaps bring a couple of comments, particularly with regard to the importance of including socioeconomic mechanisms into SSR plans. Of course, nothing of what I'm going to say about Libya has been done or even remotely tried. But for instance, given the fragmented situation of a case like the Libyan one, you need to find a mechanism to pressure the authorities into guaranteeing some sort of socio-economic investment in perhaps traditionally neglected territories where certain hybrid or non-state groups are dominating, and such mechanisms might be likely to make local groups feel less estranged and buy into the state security apparatus. Another consideration in the economic realm has to do with anti-corruption measures, and I already briefly mentioned this in my opening remarks. We, as DCAF, have tried these approaches in other countries than Libya, making sure that certain anti-corruption measures are incorporated in SSR programs. And this has been, for instance, quite successful in a country like Tunisia, where we were able to convince the Ministry of Interior or working on integrity building programs, teaming up with both civil society organizations and oversight organizations, in particularly in this case with anti-corruption, the anti-corruption watchdog. But of course, you know, the Tunisian case is a very unique one, and going back to Libya, the international community must seek to weaken the links between the armed groups and the illicit economy they profit from, and this is a major challenge. Without addressing this one, it is really complicated to fight corruption and misappropriation.
And Andrea, in the last 5 minutes, since we started with you, just to end with you as well, we've heard talk about different approaches to security sector reform in the past hour, vis-a-vis hybrid actors, vis-a-vis whether it should be top-down or sort of bottom-up within a community. Yezid said it's all inherently political efforts at security sector reform. Politically speaking, from a policy perspective, what are the obstacles to making these sorts of changes to SSR programs?
It's $1 million question. I think that I can bring the experience of an organization like DCAF, which in its limited political outreach has tried to address very political questions in a non-political way, meaning that because we're not an organization like the EU or another big organization like the UN, we need to address, as I said, the political leadership with convincing arguments that are going to make them understand that more accountability and more transparency is ultimately going to bring them a more effective security sector. And that's the big challenge which we're facing in a region like the MENA region, where on the one hand, as we said in the beginning, we have very weak state institutions. And what we are offering, it's in a way, or in many ways, a strengthening of the institutions, at the same time convincing them that in order to be strengthened, they need to be more transparent, more accountable in front of the citizens. And so we need to help them create those mechanisms that are going to reduce corruption into the institutions, make not only the institutions more transparent, but more accepted, and accepted in the sense that the citizens need to ultimately perceive the security forces as working towards their security. And so here I'm going back to the concept of human security that I mentioned in my opening remarks, which is absolutely central. As Yezid said, these are long processes that cannot be quickly, there's no quick fix. And I understand that many of the comments that have been made by all the panelists were focused on the particular challenges that these three cases of conflicts have addressed. But the comments I'm making are, in many ways going beyond the strict solutions of these conflicts. We will have to be based not only on SSR, but as I said also before, on very specifically applied peace building processes that include SSR.
Okay, thank you. And I think we are unfortunately out of time. We could keep going, but I think they're going to cut us off very shortly. So We will leave it at that. To all of the panelists, Andrea, Ranj, Eleonora, and Yezid, thank you all, and thank you to everyone who joined us. And have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Bye.